Welcome back to Mr. News Art Class. It's wonderful to see your smiling faces today. A few weeks ago, I showed you a video on how to draw 12 different patterns using nothing but circles. And today, I'm going to do the same thing but using only squares. I've gone ahead and drawn some strings in these top 4 squares because, just like last time, I want to show you some patterns that follow a path, other patterns that fill a space, and other patterns that branch out. My first path following pattern is real simple. You just make a whole bunch of squares that are on that line, and then I'm going to go back and trace that line between the squares. I used a large size pen for that. Now I'm going to use a smaller pen to make an aura around that path. And if I want to, I could fill in the original squares there a little darker. In this case, I'm using some cross-hatching. For my next path-following pattern, I'm going to start very similar to the last one, except it's kind of going to be diamond shapes instead, which just means those squares are turned at a diagonal such that the corners of the squares are touching the string. And again, I make an aura with the smaller pen. Now I could fill each one of those squares in just like I did before, or I could leave them white. Either way works fine. For my next path following pattern, I'm going to do something very similar to what I did in one of my circle patterns, which is to alternate a big square, then a little square, then a big square, then a little square, then a big square, then a little square. And this time, instead of switching to the small pen for an aura, I'm going to keep using the big pen for the aura. And I'm going to make it a really dark black aura. And at this point, it's important to point out that this really dark aura around that pattern will make it stand out if it's next to a lighter pattern, whereas these lighter patterns would stand out more if they were surrounded by dark patterns. So if I put dark patterns in the background behind this, then these diamonds with no fill in them would stand out really well, but these darker ones would stand out better if they had lighter patterns around them. Alright, I want to do one more path following pattern. And for this fourth pattern, what I'm going to do is start with a square that's on that string, and then make 2 really tiny squares, one on either side of the string, and then another big square, and 2 little tiny squares. And since this string kind of changes direction on me there, I think I'm going to just make a really big square. And for these first 3, I did an aura around them, which does, on these pathfinding patterns, help to separate them from the patterns in the background. But sometimes you want a pattern to fill the spaces between here, so if I just leave this without an aura around it, without an outline, without a line separating it from the space around it, then I could, if I was using this in a Zentangle tile, push a pattern into those spaces between and underneath this pathfinding pattern. It's also important to note that on these patterns I did start with a string that these followed, but you don't have to draw that with a pencil first. Any one of these patterns could be made without a pencil line. On this second row, I'll do some fill patterns that fill the whole space. My first fill pattern is going to start as just a square in the bottom left corner. And then I just keep making squares of different sizes, keeping a similar spacing between each of them so that it almost looks like a mosaic tile. For this next fill pattern, I'm going to create a grid of squares. And then I'm going to use my smaller pen to make details inside that grid, where for each alternating square, just like a checkerboard, instead of coloring them in black, white, I'm making the squares that would be dark on a checkerboard look like a square inside of a square inside of a square. Here I'll make another fill pattern where I use alternating rows of squares where each row starts with a big square and then has successively smaller squares after it, and some of these rows point in from the left and some point in from the right. For my last fill pattern, I'll start by drawing squares of different sizes and at different angles, randomly spread out across the space. Then I'll use my smaller pen to create auras around each square. Next I'll create a branching pattern, and for this pattern I'll start with a square in the corner, and going up from above it, make a slightly smaller square, going to the side, make a slightly smaller square, and going out from the corner, make a slightly smaller square. And keep each one of those lines going with as many squares as you want. And notice that these little rows of squares don't all have to follow any rhyme or reason. They can go whichever way you want. And this aura that I'm making is completely optional. If I'm 100% honest with you, the only reason I'm making this aura is so that I can fill it with black and cover up the mistakes that I've made with these squares. And now for the next one, I'm going to do something very similar to that, except much more structured. And instead of starting in a corner, I'm going to start in the middle. And I'm going to make some rules for myself about how I want these squares to branch out. And so I may say that for the first layer, or the first iteration we would call this. I want to have a square branch out from all 4 sides. But for the second iteration, I only want 1 square coming out from each branch. And then for the third iteration, smaller squares coming out from each side. And for the fourth iteration, same size squares, only going out in the same direction as the branch that it's on. And then I could do a 5th iteration, where these squares are so tiny that they're just going to be dots. And then the next iteration would be another of the same size, continuing in the same direction of the branch it's on. And this ends up being what we would call a fractal pattern. And if I kept going, they would be too small to see. For my next branching pattern, I'll start with a square anywhere. Maybe this one's going off the bottom of my shape. And then I'll start overlapping squares at various different angles and in various different sizes. Then I'll pick a spot to branch off from the main trunk. And just like I've said many times before, an aura is optional. You could do an aura that would wrap around this whole thing. And just because I think it would look cool, I'm going to do it. If you haven't realized it by now, auras are one of the very common themes that we see in Zentangle patterns a lot. And part of the reason they end up looking so interesting is because even though they're following the outlines of these standard shapes like squares, you end up getting these interesting little shapes made out of the auras, like these little spiky shapes going into there and into there, and these bumps coming out, that end up creating these really interesting negative spaces, or these background spaces around them. So it's just a really quick and easy way to create a whole nother layer of depth and interest in your patterns. I've got one last section here where I want to make a last little branching pattern. And what I'm going to do for this one is kind of copy one of my earlier pathfinding patterns. I'm going to start with a square on a diagonal so it looks like a diamond. Make a little loopy line coming out of it. And another diamond. And another loop. And another diamond. And this time, 2 loops. And I could also find an extra corner here to make an extra loop come off. And for that one I used the big pen for the squares and then the little pen for the aura. I'm going to show you here what it looks like if you reverse that. Here I used the small pen and I'm going to use the big pen for the auras. And there you notice that flopping which position each pen is in changes the focus, where here those thick lines in the squares bring your focus inside, and here the thick lines in the aura bring your focus out. And that's it for today's video. Stick around and watch next week where I'll show you how to use some of these square patterns in a Zentangle tile. And if you're new to Mr. New's art class, don't forget to check out some of my older videos where I showed different types of patterns you can make and different things you can do with them. And last, if you're a beginner artist and you want to learn and improve, check out my beginner art lessons that I publish every Thursday. I am a firm believer that anyone can learn how to draw if you simply remember the #1 most important factor. You don't have to be the best to do your best.